King Charles had made his final decision, and it centered on one person no one expected: Catherine. In his last public act as monarch, he placed Diana's private royal seal into her hands, declaring the transfer permanent and impossible to share. The hall fell silent because everyone understood this was not a gift. It was a promise Charles had carried since the day Diana died, and its consequences were about to reach every corner of the palace. Before we go further into what this decision truly meant for the royal family, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this story. There are details here the headlines never told you. But that single decision only makes sense once we go back to a private moment years earlier, one that began not in a palace but in a small act of kindness the world never saw. King Charles entered the final public engagement of his reign carrying more than a ceremonial document. Hidden inside the formal presentation was a promise made to Diana decades earlier, a promise involving Catherine alone. When the king called the Princess of Wales forward and placed Diana's personal royal seal into her hands, the hall fell into complete silence. This was not simply a gift. It was a declaration that changed the emotional order of the monarchy forever. Everyone gathered at St. James's Palace understood this ceremony would be unlike anything that had come before it. Trusted courtiers and representatives from Diana's former charities watched as the usual pageantry disappeared entirely. Charles had removed the military music, shortened the procession, and rejected traditional speeches so that nothing would distract from the weight of what he was about to do. Catherine felt the tension before she even heard her name spoken. She had arrived believing she would simply witness the monarch's final ceremonial act. But when Charles turned toward her, she looked first at William, then at the document in his hands. William did not move. His mother's handwriting, visible on the edge of the page, left him struggling to hold his composure. Charles watched his son carefully, aware that this honor could never be separated from the grief that had shaped him for nearly 3 decades. Then the monarch stated the decision without hesitation. Diana's private royal seal, her handwritten legacy declaration, and sole responsibility for protecting the causes closest to her heart would pass to Catherine and Catherine alone. A royal seal is traditionally a personal mark used to authenticate important instructions, but this one carried something far heavier than administrative authority. It carried memory itself. Camilla remained seated apart from the presentation table throughout the ceremony. Her expression tightened visibly when the king added, without softening the words, that the transfer could not be amended, divided, or shared with anyone, not now, not in the future, not under any household arrangement that might come later. Catherine opened her hand. Charles placed the old silver seal into her palm, closed her fingers gently around it, and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "This was always meant to reach you." William lowered his eyes, but nothing could hide what the moment had done to him. Catherine stood frozen between sorrow and duty, suddenly aware she was inheriting not a title but a burden shaped by a woman she had never had the chance to meet. Then Charles lifted the declaration and revealed a second sealed page hidden beneath it, a page that contained the reason Diana had chosen Catherine long before Catherine had ever entered royal life. The room absorbed the weight of that revelation in near total silence. Diana's charities had operated for years under shared institutional oversight. Now, in a single sentence, that oversight had been dissolved and handed entirely to one woman who had never known the person who wrote the instruction. Catherine had spent years being quietly compared to Diana in public commentary and newspaper columns in the careful language of royal correspondence. But this moment was different in a way she immediately understood. A comparison could be dismissed as public fascination, something that would fade with time. A final wish formally declared by the reigning monarch could not be dismissed at all. As she stood holding the seal, William saw 2 chapters of his life collide in front of him: the mother he had lost as a boy and the wife who had carried him through the long, quiet burden of becoming king. Charles, watching his son and daughter-in-law from a few feet away, saw something else entirely. The answer to a promise he had once feared he would never be able to fulfill. No one in that hall spoke. No aide moved to explain further. The ceremony that was meant to mark the end of a reign had instead opened something none of them were fully prepared to face, and as the silver seal rested in Catherine's palm, one question hung unspoken over every person in the room: why had Charles waited until his very last day as king to finally keep this promise? The ceremony ended, but the hall did not return to normal. Officials filed out quietly, and the formal atmosphere gave way to something rawer. 4 people each carrying a different version of what had just happened. William stood at the center of it, though he said nothing. For years he had built a careful emotional distance from conversations about his mother, answering questions about her with practiced neutrality whenever the press or public brought her up. But there had been no distance possible in that hall. Watching his father place Diana's seal into his wife's hands had forced him to confront something he had spent decades avoiding: the reality that his mother's presence had never actually left the monarchy. It had simply been waiting. He felt pride in Catherine, genuine and immediate, but beneath that pride sat something harder to name: a quiet, unwelcome grief resurfacing exactly when he had least expected it, in a ceremony he had believed was about his father's final public duty, not his mother's unfinished one. Catherine, meanwhile, stood holding an object she barely understood the full meaning of yet. She had accepted royal duty many times before: engagements, patronages, formal appearances, but this was different. This was not a role assigned by the institution. It was a role assigned by a woman who had died before Catherine had ever set foot inside royal life. She did not know yet what would be expected of her, only that whatever it was, it could not be shared, delayed, or handed back. Camilla's reaction was quieter and, for that reason, more difficult to read. She had not raised her voice. She had not left the room. But something in her had shifted the moment Charles said the word "only." For years, Camilla had built her place beside Charles, carefully, patiently, often absorbing public criticism without complaint. She had believed that place was secure. Watching her husband's final act as king center entirely on Diana's unfinished wishes told her something she had not wanted to hear: that some chapters of Charles's life had never actually closed, no matter how much time had passed. Charles felt something closer to relief than triumph, though even he could not fully separate the two. He had carried this obligation for years, delaying it through fear, through protocol, through the simple difficulty of knowing how to keep a promise to someone no longer alive to receive it. Now that it was done, he felt lighter, but he also understood, watching his son's face and his wife's controlled stillness, that lightening his own burden had placed a new one onto every person standing in that hall. None of them spoke about what had just happened in any direct way. William offered no explanation to Catherine. Catherine asked him no questions in front of others. Camilla said nothing at all, choosing instead to leave with the same composure she had entered with. But composure was not resolution. Each of them walked away from that ceremony carrying an unanswered question of their own. William wondered how long his father had known this moment was coming and why he had never mentioned it. Catherine wondered what exactly Diana had seen in a woman she had never met. Camilla wondered whether this was truly about honoring the past, or whether it was in some quiet way meant to remind her of her place. None of them yet understood how this had really begun. Not in that hall, not even in Charles's private planning for his final ceremony, but years earlier, in a moment none of them had witnessed, when Diana herself had first decided exactly what the crown would one day need. To understand what had just taken place inside St. James's Palace, it was necessary to go back decades, long before Catherine had entered royal life, long before William had married, long before Charles had ever imagined presiding over his own final ceremony as king. The origin of the promise did not begin with a formal decision or a legal document. It began during a small royal charity reception at Kensington Palace, in a moment that lasted less than 3 minutes and that almost no one outside the immediate room ever knew about. Diana had grown increasingly frustrated in her later years with the rigid formality of royal protocol, the fixed schedules, the carefully managed receiving lines, the sense that appearances so often mattered more than the people standing directly in front of them. Protocol in the traditional sense referred to the formal rules governing royal engagements, but to Diana those rules had begun to feel less like structure and more like a wall separating the monarchy from the very people it was meant to serve. This concern was not abstract to her. Her public strength, the reason millions of people felt connected to her in a way they had never felt connected to a royal figure before, came directly from moments of unguarded human contact. A hand held a second too long, a conversation that ran past its scheduled time, an unwillingness to look away from someone in pain simply because an aide was signaling that the schedule was falling behind. At the reception that evening, a 12-year-old girl stepped forward, hoping to speak briefly about her mother who had recently died. An aide began to guide the child gently away, aware that senior guests were waiting and the schedule had already begun slipping. Diana stopped him with a single raised hand. She crossed the room, knelt beside the girl, and remained there as the carefully planned schedule collapsed around her. The child began to cry. Diana did not rush. Did not glance toward the waiting line, did not allow the quiet warnings from staff to move her from that spot until the girl had said everything she needed to say. Later that evening, Diana sat privately with a trusted secretary and gave a recorded account of what had happened. Her voice, by all accounts, remained calm, but her words carried unusual severity. She said in essence that the monarchy would eventually fail if appearances were ever allowed to matter more than the person standing directly in front of it. That night, she opened the draft of her personal legacy declaration, a private handwritten instruction outlining how her charitable authority should be carried forward after her death. She added a new clause, one that had not existed in earlier drafts. Her charitable authority must eventually belong to a future Princess of Wales who demonstrated compassion under pressure, not simply status or proximity to the throne. She was equally clear about what would not be enough. Rank would not qualify someone. Marriage alone would not qualify someone. Popularity or closeness to the reigning monarch would not qualify someone either. Taking her pen, she crossed out the phrase "closest female relation" from an earlier version of the document and replaced it with a new condition written in her own hand: the woman who protects the human heart of the crown. At the time, this was simply a private amendment inside a personal document, unknown to the public, unknown even to most of the royal household. No one could have said in that moment who such a woman might eventually be, or whether she would ever exist within the family at all. But years later, Charles would witness something that made the answer unmistakable to him. And what happened afterward would change everything that followed. Years after Diana had written that private clause, Charles witnessed something that convinced him without any doubt that her condition had finally been fulfilled. During a hospital engagement, Catherine had paused mid-schedule to comfort a grieving mother, setting aside the carefully planned itinerary despite an aide's quiet urging to continue moving. There were no cameras present to capture the moment, no official record made of it, no applause. Charles, watching from a distance, recognized the choice instantly for what it was. In that unremarkable, unrecorded instant, he understood that Diana's condition, written years earlier in a private document most people did not know existed, had been met. He said nothing about it publicly for a long time, but the recognition changed something in him, and eventually it led to a confrontation he could no longer avoid. Behind the closed doors of the king's private library, Camilla faced Charles without aides, without secretaries, without anyone present to soften the exchange. She had learned by then that Catherine now held exclusive authority over Diana's seal, her charitable archive, and her unfinished initiatives, and that the transfer was, by Charles's own instruction, final and unchangeable. Camilla did not question Catherine's character or her compassion. Her question was more precise and more painful. Had Charles's final act as king been designed to honor Diana or to punish Camilla for the life they had built together in Diana's absence? Charles answered carefully that keeping a promise was not the same as inflicting punishment, even if it felt that way to her. But his composure, usually steady in difficult conversations, cracked for the first time that day. Camilla's restraint broke as well. She accused him of allowing the past to eclipse everything they had built since. Charles in turn admitted something he had avoided saying directly for years, that certain promises did not expire simply because the people involved had moved forward with their lives. He told her for the first time the full account of how long he had known about Diana's instruction. He had known well before this ceremony. He had delayed acting on it, deliberately waiting for Catherine to demonstrate through her own unprompted choices that she matched the description Diana had written decades earlier. Camilla asked what had finally convinced him. Charles described the hospital engagement, the unwitnessed, uncelebrated moment when Catherine had chosen a grieving stranger over a schedule that he said was when he knew. Camilla removed her gloves and set them down with controlled precision. Then she asked the question that had clearly been building beneath everything else: did Diana still hold the final word in their marriage? Charles met her directly. "Not in our marriage," he said, "in this promise." The distinction did little to soften what she had just heard, and her anger gave way to something quieter and more difficult, a private humiliation that Charles could see settling over her even as he refused to reconsider his decision. Before either of them could say more, the library door opened. William entered, carrying a second version of the declaration, one recognized not simply as a personal letter but as a legally binding document. His expression made one thing immediately clear to both of them. Charles was no longer the only person with authority over what Diana had asked for. Something larger than a private promise had already been set into motion, and it was about to reveal exactly how far its reach extended. William did not enter the library as an angry son defending his mother's memory. He entered as the future sovereign, carrying a document already formally recognized by the Crown's private legal counsel. What he placed on the desk changed the nature of everything that had come before it. Diana's wish, it turned out, had never remained simple sentimental wording confined to an old private letter. At some point, Charles had used his remaining authority as monarch to transform it into a binding royal trust, a protected legal arrangement placing Diana's seal, her charitable archive, her patronages, and her reserved funds under Catherine's exclusive stewardship. Camilla understood the consequence immediately. This was no longer a matter of affection, permission, or even the king's personal discretion. A royal trust by definition exists specifically to remove decisions from the influence of shifting relationships or changing sentiment. Charles had made certain that even his own future change of heart could not undo it. William had been named protector within the structure of the trust, but the document made his limits explicit. He could not overrule his wife's decisions regarding it. He could not redirect its funds. He could not even, as future king, absorb Diana's legacy into an extension of his own royal office. The independence of her work had been legally guaranteed to outlast his reign entirely. For William, the realization carried weight in two directions at once. Part of him wanted to defend his mother's final wish exactly as it had been written without compromise. But watching Camilla read the terms in front of him, he could not ignore the pain visibly spreading across her expression as she absorbed just how completely she had been excluded. Catherine, waiting beyond the closed door while the conversation continued, heard voices rise and fall without being able to make out the words clearly. When she was finally invited in, she asked whether the responsibility might be shared in some way in the hope of preventing a deeper split within the family. Charles's answer left no room for a negotiation. Diana had written only. Changing that single word, he said, would betray the clearest instruction she had left behind. Camilla read Catherine's name on the legal document once, then a second time, then a third, before pushing the paper back across the desk without signing the acknowledgement line. The silence that followed carried more weight than any argument could have. Charles pointed to an additional clause, one preventing any palace staff, future consorts, or royal committees from using Diana's image publicly without Catherine's written approval. Then he mentioned something none of them had discussed until that moment, a private audio recording listed in the trust's official register containing Diana's own explanation of what she had feared might happen to her public mission after her death. Catherine felt the room tighten around the mention of it. William stared at the description of the recording, visibly unsettled, while Charles admitted quietly that he himself had never listened to it in full. Before the family could decide when or whether to hear it together, a secretary arrived with urgent news from elsewhere in the palace. Word of the exclusive transfer had already reached staff offices. Schedules were being rewritten without explanation. Senior aides were reportedly threatening resignation, and at least one courtier had already refused to comply with Catherine's first instruction under the new authority. By nightfall, what had begun as a private family matter inside a locked library had escaped into the wider machinery of the palace, and its consequences were now moving faster than any of them could contain. The transfer had required only a single signature, but its effects moved through the palace far beyond that one formal act. Offices were reassigned within hours. Invitations that had once been issued automatically to certain staff were quietly withdrawn. Diana's archive correspondence, photographs, charitable agreements was removed entirely from shared administrative control and placed under Catherine's authority before the day had even ended. Some courtiers described the change as long overdue. Others viewed it as a dangerous concentration of influence in someone still relatively new to the institution's inner workings. The most telling reaction, however, came from Camilla. Returning to her private rooms that evening, she discovered that one ceremonial key, the one granting access to Diana's historic archive, was already missing from where it had always hung. Palace staff had moved quickly to redirect Diana-related correspondence, jewelry records, charitable agreements, and formal permissions governing the public use of Diana's image, placing all of it under Catherine's office before Camilla had even been informed the transfer was underway. A formal permission of that kind exists to control how a royal figure's image letters or personal items may be used in public settings. Holding authority over those approvals gave Catherine genuine practical power over how Diana's memory would be presented to the public going forward, not simply symbolic recognition, but real institutional control. Charles, aware that any hesitation would invite resistance, canceled his remaining scheduled meetings and ordered the transfer completed in full before formally withdrawing from active royal duties. He understood better than most in the palace how quickly opposition could organize once uncertainty took hold. Catherine, meanwhile, began hearing herself referred to repeatedly as the sole guardian of Diana's legacy, a title she had not requested and had not fully processed. Each repetition of the phrase made the responsibility feel heavier rather than more familiar. Quiet murmurs also began circulating that she had accepted the role too easily without hesitation, as though she had been waiting for it. William, learning that several courtiers were privately blaming his wife for decisions that had in fact been made entirely by his father, allowed his usual restraint to give way to something closer to anger. He warned one senior advisor directly that Catherine would not serve as a convenient target for decisions she had not made. Camilla's own experience of the change was quieter but no less significant. Her office no longer held automatic access to Diana's historic files, records that had for years been used routinely for royal anniversaries and public exhibitions. Alone in her sitting room that evening, she found herself simply staring at the place where the ceremonial key had once hung before closing the empty cabinet with deliberate, controlled force. The loss was modest in physical terms, its meaning was not. Elsewhere in the palace, one senior courtier attempted to redirect a sealed archive box toward Clarence House, rather than Catherine's office, apparently hoping to slow or reverse part of the transfer. Princess Anne intercepted him in a corridor before he could complete the attempt. Without offering any explanation, she took the box from his hands and delivered it directly to Catherine herself. The gesture required no further comment from anyone present. It settled without a single word being exchanged exactly where the family's new line of authority now rested. By evening, the archive itself had been fully secured under Catherine's authority, and with it came the one part of the transfer no one in the family had yet been prepared to face together: the private recording Diana had left behind, still unheard. There were no officials present when Diana's recorded voice finally played. No photographers, no advisors, no legal representatives stood between the past and the three people gathered to hear it. Charles sat across from William. Catherine held the recorder carefully in both hands. The message was not an accusation, and it was not a demand for anything to be undone. It was more simply a mother's plea that whoever eventually stood beside her son must protect his humanity and never allow the demands of duty to turn him into someone unrecognizable even to himself. Diana had recorded the message shortly after amending her legacy declaration, not long after the incident at the Kensington Palace charity reception that had first clarified her thinking. William listened as his mother spoke about the particular loneliness waiting for him as a future king. A loneliness she seemed to have anticipated with unusual clarity, even as a young mother raising two small boys inside an institution not built for tenderness. He had heard countless public tributes to Diana over the years, carefully composed and widely broadcast. This was entirely different. These words had been directed specifically at the man he had not yet become, and grief he believed he had long since processed rose in him without warning. Catherine watched his expression tighten as Diana's recorded voice warned that duty left unchecked could slowly separate a person from everyone they loved without that person ever noticing it happening. Charles lowered his head as the recording turned toward the subject of sacrifice. Diana had said plainly that the crown must never demand that love be abandoned simply to preserve appearances. Charles understood immediately why those particular words struck as hard as they did. They reached far beyond the past, directly toward the very system he had spent his adult life defending and upholding. Then came the part of the recording that clarified everything that had followed. Diana said she might never come to know the specific woman chosen to carry her legacy forward, but that this woman must stand beside William without ever being controlled or diminished by his rank. She must be willing to challenge him when necessary and to remind him when needed that a sovereign who loses the capacity to feel becomes nothing more than a symbol. The recording's closing words removed any lingering suggestion of rivalry between the two women who would come to matter most in William's life. Diana's legacy, she made clear, was never intended to compete with the monarchy itself. It was intended to protect the institution from becoming emotionally hollow. When the recording ended, William could not immediately speak. Catherine reached toward him, but Charles crossed the room, first placing a hand on his son's shoulder. William finally looked up, and the long-standing silence between father and son softened into something neither of them had fully expected. Shared grief offered without defense or explanation. Catherine told Charles she would accept the responsibility Diana had left her, but only if it brought the family together rather than humiliating anyone within it, including Camilla. Charles agreed and went further, asking Catherine to decide for herself how Diana's wish would ultimately be presented to the public, giving her not only legal authority over the legacy, but moral control over how its story would be told. Catherine rejected the idea of a triumphant public statement. Instead, she chose a single restrained public appearance, one designed to convey the meaning of the decision without turning private grief into public spectacle. Britain did not wake the next morning to a triumphant palace announcement or an orchestrated media campaign. Instead, the public first learned of the transfer through a single image: Catherine standing outside Kensington Palace holding Diana's silver seal, speaking quietly with families, supported by the late princess's charities. There was no crown, no ceremonial robe, no visible attempt to imitate the woman whose legacy she now carried. That restraint shaped how the public received the news. Catherine's office confirmed that a newly established Diana Legacy Trust would support grief counseling programs, homelessness initiatives, children's hospitals, and other causes originally identified in Diana's private archive. A royal trust, by its legal nature, exists to ensure that funds and responsibilities remain fixed to a defined purpose regardless of changing circumstances, meaning this particular structure guaranteed that Diana's charitable priorities could not later be reshaped for convenience or political expedience. Buckingham Palace subsequently confirmed through a formal written statement that Charles's final public duty as monarch had been precisely this transfer, and that Catherine alone would guide its future direction. Public reaction split quickly along familiar lines. Supporters described the decision as a meaningful bridge between Diana's compassion and the monarchy's next chapter. Critics argued that the palace had reopened wounds many had assumed were long since settled. Camilla watched the coverage privately, apparently anticipating language that would diminish her position beside the king. Instead, Catherine's public remarks acknowledged the queen consort, directly stating that honoring one woman's legacy did not require diminishing another's place within the family. For Camilla, the gesture proved more unsettling than any direct criticism might have been. It denied her the specific grievance she had prepared herself to defend against. William remained several steps behind his wife throughout the public appearance. Observers noted he appeared visibly moved, though there was evident relief in his expression, as Catherine consistently avoided turning his mother's memory into a public spectacle. She confirmed publicly that Diana's private recording would remain permanently sealed, protecting both William's grief and Charles's private regret from becoming subjects of public commentary. She also stated one further boundary. Clearly, no member of the royal family, including herself, would be permitted to commercialize Diana's name or image through the new trust in any capacity. The following morning, a major national newspaper published a widely circulated photograph of Catherine holding the hand of a bereaved child beneath a headline describing the moment simply as a promise kept. The image, more than any official statement, appeared to settle much of the public debate on its own terms. Charles, watching the coverage unfold, understood something the public commentary had not yet addressed. The reconciliation playing out publicly did not mean the private conflict within the family had been fully resolved. Before the day ended, he summoned Catherine, William, and Camilla to one final private meeting, determined to explain directly and without institutional formality what his last act as king had actually meant. The gathering Charles called for that evening bore no resemblance to a formal royal meeting. It took place around a small table without court officials present to record proceedings, without any ceremonial audience waiting outside the room. Catherine placed Diana's silver seal on the table between them. William sat beside her. Camilla took her place across from the king. What followed did not erase decades of accumulated pain between any of them, but it marked the end of an active struggle over what Diana's final wish actually represented within the family. Charles began by explaining plainly why he had chosen this particular promise as his final visible act of royal service. He had carried the obligation unresolved for years, delayed repeatedly by fear, by rigid protocol, and by his own difficulty in confronting an unfinished conversation with someone no longer alive to have it with him. He said he had refused to leave it unfinished for one more day than necessary. He was careful to clarify what the decision did not change. The fixed constitutional order determining royal succession remained entirely untouched. Catherine's new role did not replace any existing royal position, and it did not represent any claim to Diana's identity. She had become instead the permanent moral guardian of a specific humanitarian legacy, nothing more and nothing less. Charles then turned to William directly and apologized. He admitted that his own instinct to protect appearances had delayed the declaration for far longer than necessary, allowing his son to believe mistakenly that Diana's wishes had simply been forgotten over time. William listened without interrupting, and something in the resentment he had carried for years visibly began to soften as his father spoke. Turning to Catherine, Charles told her plainly that Diana had never asked for a replacement version of herself. She had asked specifically for someone capable of protecting a form of compassion the monarchy itself had often failed to fully understand or accommodate. Catherine accepted the explanation with quiet composure, then turned her attention toward Camilla. She offered the Queen Consort a defined place within future charitable commemorations connected to the trust, while making one boundary unmistakably clear: control over the trust itself would remain exactly as Diana had originally instructed, with no exceptions. Camilla paused before responding. She acknowledged finally that being excluded from formal authority over the trust did not require her to be excluded from the family itself. Charles looked at her with something closer to gratitude than relief, aware of what that acknowledgement had cost her to say aloud. He then offered his own final admission. Fulfilling this particular promise had not brought him any immediate sense of triumph. It had instead forced him to accept that honoring the past sometimes requires surrendering control over exactly how that past will ultimately be remembered by others. Charles lifted the silver seal from the table one last time and placed it back into Catherine's hand. In that moment, he was not acting as a sovereign directing a future queen. He was more simply a man completing a promise to someone he had once deeply wounded. William stood and embraced his father. Catherine closed her fingers around the seal without hesitation. Camilla, for her part, accepted the limits of her position without visible bitterness, a quiet resolution that none of them could have predicted at the start of that difficult day. Diana's legacy, after years of remaining an unfinished private instruction, finally had a guardian formally recognized by the institution itself. William, after decades of unresolved grief resurfacing at unexpected moments, found something closer to peace than he had known in years. And Charles, having carried this particular obligation since the earliest days of his reign, could finally consider his final duty as king complete. Nothing about the outcome had been a victory in the conventional sense. No one in that room had emerged as a clear winner, and no one had been made to disappear from the family's future. What had changed instead was quieter and more difficult to summarize in a single sentence. A responsibility deferred for years out of fear and institutional caution had finally been accepted in full. Catherine's new role carried real institutional weight: legal control over an archive, a set of charitable causes, and a private recording that would remain permanently sealed from public view. But what defined the outcome was not the legal structure itself. It was the specific unwitnessed choice that had originally justified it: a moment in a hospital corridor, unrecorded and unapplauded, when a woman chose to kneel beside a grieving stranger instead of following a schedule. Camilla's position within the family had narrowed in one specific respect, though not in the way she had initially feared. She retained her place beside Charles. What she had lost was a form of institutional authority she had in truth never formally held, to begin with access to an archive that had always belonged in spirit, if not in law, to someone else's unfinished work. William, meanwhile, carried forward something he had not expected to gain from any of this: a clearer understanding of his mother, formed not through public tributes or carefully worded biographies, but through her own private words, recorded specifically for a moment she would never live to witness. And Charles, in the final days before formally withdrawing from active royal life, understood something about his own reign that he had perhaps not fully recognized until that evening. Some promises cannot be fulfilled through public ceremony alone. They require eventually the quieter and more difficult work of admitting what was delayed, what it cost the people around you, and what it finally took to set it right. Diana's silver seal now rested permanently in Catherine's care, not as a symbol of one woman replacing another, but as confirmation that compassion, however quietly practiced, had ultimately outlasted every institutional barrier built to contain it.